This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. More than 5,000 wild species are at risk of extinction in Canada right now. It's an overwhelming, staggering number, and it begs the question, what are we doing about it? Environmental journalist Sarah Cox explores this question with hope and curiosity in her new book, Signs of Life: Field Notes from the Frontlines of Extinction. Featuring interviews and experiences with advocates, researchers, Indigenous peoples, and even the Canadian military, Sarah explores several species at risk of extinction in Signs of Life and what's being done by different people to make an impact. Signs of Life is a must-read for wildlife and environmental advocates in Canada, or anyone interested in how we can make an impact on climate change. Sarah joins Defender Radio to share more about what motivated her to write Signs of Life, how she manages the difficult narratives she shares, and how people of all walks of life can make a difference for the future. I think the smart place to start this conversation is kind of, how did you get into becoming, an award-winning author and journalist, taking on environmental issues, profiling issues that others aren't, investigating things and bringing things to light? And then from there, how did we get to the new book? But maybe start a little earlier to give it that context.
Right. So I have been a journalist for quite a long time, and I would say I've been exclusively an environmental journalist for the last 8 years or so. During that 8 years, I also wrote 2 books about environmental issues, and both books stemmed from my reporting. Mm-hmm. And so I am an environmental journalist because I care passionately about the environment and biodiversity and species at risk. And I see very clearly the interconnections between human well-being and the well-being of the natural world. And I also just love to spend time in nature. So in my spare time, I do a lot of hiking and backpacking and kayaking and long distance walking and all those wonderful things that really connect me with the outdoors.
That's lovely. And then was it just as the process of writing for Narwhal and other publications where you started to piece together maybe the narrative of Signs of Life, that sort of overall messaging that you wanted to get out into the world?
That's right. It very much stems from reporting I did for the Narwhal. I was doing stories kind of here, there, and everywhere about species at risk. And I started to see a pattern, which was that we were investing a huge amount of money and time and effort into trying to save a species at the very last minute. So at the 11th hour, when they were already in, nature's equivalent of the ICU, and started to look at what was going on, like hatching spotted owls in a lab while forest sounds play in the background, flying pregnant caribou to mountaintop pens where they were held and fed hand-picked lichen until their calves were old enough to stand a chance of surviving in the wild. And I just started to collect these stories and wanted to make it into more of a narrative about the increasingly elaborate and expensive things we are doing to try to save these species, and then how we got into this situation, why we are not stepping in earlier to try to protect species and biodiversity, and also how do we turn things around? How do we get to a better place so that we're not spending, $10,000 at a time to shoot one wolf that threatens an endangered caribou herd, or not hatching spotted owls in a lab while there really are none left in Canada's wild.
I think something that I am surprised I still encounter, but there are people out there who don't understand why we should make that effort. So, there's not that many of them left. We could spend all of this money and not succeed. And really, and this, I can't do this, it's a podcast, but air quotes, big sarcastic face, what does it really matter if one type of owl doesn't survive when we've got these other ones?
Right.
So I'm curious, how do you handle that? To sort of, because the conversations you have in this book are essential for people, I think, to understand what's happening. But there has to be that first acceptance of why this matters.
Yeah, so if we want to look at it purely from a selfish point of view for our own survival
Mhm.
as a species, we are very much dependent on the natural world and we are very much dependent on biodiversity. For example, three-quarters of global food crops are pollinated by insect, bird, or animal species. So we can say, well, what happens if just one of those disappears? What happens if one type of bee disappears? And what happens if another one disappears? Well, it's a very slippery slope to getting
Mhm.
to the point where there are very few bee species and then fewer crops for ourselves. But there's another way of looking at it too, which is the view that I subscribe to, which is that these other beings on the planet have an intrinsic right to exist. In many cases,
Mhm.
they have species that are now in critical danger of winking out have been on the planet for far longer than human beings have. And so who are we to come along as a species and say, no, you no longer have a right to exist?
It does seem very much like that's the narrative that has been created by humanity of, well, we're here now, so we're going to do what we think is right and what we think is valuable. And I do I have wondered often back when I was working full time as a journalist, now working in nonprofit sector with the fur bears. I do wonder about the application of the precautionary principle. So when we're unsure, for listeners, we're unsure of what the result will be of a scientific query or exercise, we pull back and we go, well, we should find out what the possibilities are before we go face first into a 2-inch deep puddle. I am surprised as I have read through your book and as I have followed these issues nationally over the last several years to find that the precautionary principle seems to be a distant idea or dream, not one that is ever often exercised. And we see that, I think, talking about the caribou, that's like, yes, they're doing all of this work to save the caribou, but they're also still allowing access roads in owl habitat. They're still bringing down forests. So I guess there's sort of that combo of why do you think we aren't using it? And then the flip of it, or the follow up to that, is why does government seem to get away with talking about prioritizing these things, but then not actually following through fully?
Right. And we certainly don't very often follow the precautionary principle here. And hence we get to the place where we are today, where 5,000 wild species in Canada are at some risk of extinction, and almost 900 of them are critically imperiled. So we put ourselves in a situation by not following the precautionary principle of having to invest huge amount of time and many resources into trying to save something at the very last minute. And I think that governments are not particularly paying attention because our top priority has always been resource extraction. But it
Yeah.
has been resource extraction largely at the cost of the environment and at the cost of other species. It has not been resource extraction that balances out the need of biodiversity and the environment and other species with our need as human beings to extract resources. And part of the problem in Canada is jurisdiction, because everybody
Right.
says, well, don't we have a Species at Risk Act? Don't we have legal protections for species? And yes, we do. We have a federal Species at Risk Act that was came into place more than 20 years ago, and that act automatically applies only to species on federal land. And if you look at a province like BC, well, that's about 1% of BC is
Mhm.
federal land. So aside from migratory birds, marine mammals, and a few other instances, we are looking at legislation that applies to very few species in very few places across the country. And provinces promised more than 20 years ago, almost 30 years ago, to enact their own legislation to protect species at risk. And that largely hasn't happened. There are five, I believe, provinces, including my home province of British Columbia, that didn't follow through on that, and other provinces like Ontario followed through on that, but don't often adhere to their own
Mhm.
law, which puts environmental law charities like the group EcoJustice in the situation of constantly having to take governments to court to try to compel them to follow their own laws.
I was really taken. The book is written in a very enjoyable way for me. I always appreciate this style of writing where it's a series of interviews effectively and experiences woven together into the narrative. I find that very easy to digest myself, and it really showcases the people behind a lot of these issues, which I think does get left out. And talking about cormorants in Ontario, you mentioned many people I've spent time with and greatly admire. So it was great to see them sort of profiled in a way in this. But I think that's a great example of a lot of the issues we're facing that you point out are ones that we actually kind of created. And the cormorants is one of those examples. Do you feel we're still in that process of making those mistakes where we're trying to correct for something or we're trying to manage something and just setting ourselves up for a slap in the face in a generation?
Yeah, so one chapter in the book looks at the idea of killing one species to, quote, save another. And as you say, cormorants in Lake Erie are one species that I look at. I mean, we are shooting barred owls to try to, quote, save spotted owls. We're shooting wolves and cougars and bears to try to save caribou. And we are shooting cormorants to try to save a very tiny piece of the endangered Carolinian ecosystem here in southern Ontario, when human beings have been responsible for destroying most of that ecosystem. So something is clearly very out of balance here. And if our solutions are to just kill species that are causing problems for other species, killing cormorants who are causing problems for endangered Kentucky trees, Kentucky coffee trees, and other vegetation, then that is not a solution. That is a short-term band-aid potential. I don't even want to call it a solution. It's a short-term band-aid measure. It's not getting at the root of the problem necessarily, which is largely, but not exclusively, habitat destruction. And while there is clear evidence that in some cases this can help in the short term, for example, it is well documented that when we have highly endangered caribou herds that are threatened by a natural predator, wolves, that shooting wolves and reducing the wolf population can help that caribou population that is absolutely on the brink from becoming locally extinct. It is of little avail in the long term if we are continuing to destroy caribou habitat, if we are continuing to destroy the Carolinian ecosystem, so that one of the few places where it is left intact is on this little tiny island in Lake Erie, where we are shooting cormorants to try to protect that vegetation.
It sounds very much like we need to be better at making goals in a lot of ways. We need SMART goals, and we need to start applying some of the things like the 7 principles of wildlife management or ethical wildlife control. Elements like that, where it starts challenging, is the cormorant the problem, or is the fact that we have, and my favorite example for a long time was Canada geese. For those who don't know, Canada geese were locally extinct in Ontario for a long time, but I think it was farmers or scientists in Minnesota started breeding them, released them. They came back to an environment devoid of predators that used to keep their population in check and went, cool, you guys also like short grass by the water. Thanks for setting up all of these properties for us. And municipalities and cities have spent millions of dollars addling eggs and oiling eggs and transporting geese and all of this. And the best solutions I have seen around stormwater management ponds, around popular tourist areas, is put a shrub between the water and the grass. And the geese don't want to be there anymore because they can't make a beeline into the water. And that's their entire desire. So if you take away their sight line to the water, you just make that minor landscape change, all of a sudden the problem isn't the same. You have mitigated a big part of it. And yes, okay, now we also need to make sure that foxes can access geese eggs and snakes are like all of these other biodiversity related things. But to me, that has always been a very clear example of we created the problem. We also have very simple solutions, but for some reason, certain people just don't want to implement them and instead want to complain or go off on these big extravagant things where we just keep blaming nature effectively for being nature, which to me, Does sound very much like running face first into a brick wall, getting up, shaking your head, and going, "Wow, where'd that come from?" And then just trying it again and again and again until we're, on the front lines of extinction, as one might write. Um, when you were writing about this, as someone who's very clearly compassionate and passionate for wildlife and nature, was it difficult to remain somewhat impartial? I don't think impartiality is necessarily possible in a narrative like this, but you did provide a lot of insight for the other reasons. Like you didn't just say they're bad, they're doing this. You did provide some reasoning behind things. Was that a difficult place for you as a journalist?
Not really, because as a journalist, I'm used to presenting different points of view. So I did
Mhm.
want to write a book that appealed to a variety of people. Like, for example, I didn't want somebody in the logging industry to pick up the book and throw it down. I wanted them to read the book
Yeah.
and think about maybe better ways that we can log
Hmm.
areas that we might not want to log, old growth forests that are greatly diminishing. Can we focus more on second growth logging, that sort of thing? So in that
Yeah.
sense, I was trying to weave in different viewpoints, but I think, and I hope, the overall message is that we are trashing the natural world. We are not on a good path here in Canada. People think of Canada as this natural wonderland. That's how we market ourselves to the world. But the path that we're on now, with so many species at risk of extinction, is not a good one. And we need to change things, not just for the other beings that we share the planet with, but for ourselves as well, and for our own survival as a species.
Yeah, that's very well said. I do wonder on the sort of the backside of that question, the emotional impact of covering these issues is great. I've written about ecological grief and the secondary trauma that can occur from scientists who are seeing this, or even people in your own neighborhood. All of a sudden, things aren't growing, or the weather is drastically changed. In Ontario, we just came through a heat dome in June where temperatures were reaching 45 degrees. That is not normal, and it's changing around us and affecting everything. It really, really is. Um, I'd like to ask this in two parts. One, if you're willing to speak at all about how you manage that, um, sort of again, from that, keeping in mind that it's a part of your profession as well, that you need to be able to keep writing and looking at some of these things in order to do it.
Right. So I think on a very personal level, I manage that by going and spending time in the natural world. I find that no
Hmm.
matter how despairing I feel, or how um, just frustrated with efforts at large to try to do something, I go out and I go hiking for a day in the wilderness area, which thankfully is not too far from where I live, or I go out paddling on the ocean, and I feel very rejuvenated very quickly.
Hmm.
Like just within a few hours, just connecting with nature in my own city, in my own backyard, watching birds. I've recently started to learn birds and taken up bird watching. I don't want to call myself a
Hmm.
bird watcher. I'm not quite there yet, but I just love watching birds, and I get so much joy out of looking at them. So I think very much for me it's connecting with nature around me. And I think kind of on a bigger level, I feel more hopeful now than I did when I started writing the book, which really surprises me, because I wrote it also as kind of a bit of a wake up call. Like, look where we're
Yeah.
going with this. This is, from one point of view, it just seems crazy that we're hatching spotted owls in a lab, and flying caribou around in helicopters, and flying wood bison sperm on Air Canada. And um, in writing the book and in doing some of the traveling that I did for it, I met so many people right across the country who are so engaged in protecting species and biodiversity, from scientists working in labs, to scientists working in the field, to reintroductions of species, to people who are taking matters into their own hands in their own communities across the country, to First Nations who are declaring Indigenous protected and conserved areas to protect old growth, to protect biodiversity, to protect species. that I really came away with a great deal of hope, knowing there are so many people across the country doing something. And I think very much people do feel a bit despondent these days. And a really good place to start is just in your own backyard. And I mean that,
Mhm.
I know not everybody has a backyard, but in your own backyard, figuratively, in your own community, what is going on? In my community, there's everything from removing invasive species like Scotch broom to restoring Garry oak ecosystems. And it's possible to connect on a very local level with those type of initiatives.
That's a great suggestion, and I think it's easy to look at the majestic, beautiful animals that we see as our national symbols and uh, uh, our future in many ways, right? You see the wolves out there hunting, and you go, "Yes, that means things are good." When we see that happening, but we forget that the invasive grapevine behind your house that's strangling out a native plant is part of the problem and can be part of the solution. I did a community planting recently. That was a ton of fun. I volunteered at. And while it's not going to create a huge ecosystem, it creates a little bit of connectivity between patches and maybe some habitat and food sources for smaller mammals, which is absolutely lovely. I quite enjoy that. And it can be that simple. It doesn't have to be going out and grabbing the helicopter like Captain America did in that movie and pulling it back down to the ground before it can go shoot a wolf. As much as many of us would love to try doing that, I don't think the physics checks out. And I just don't look that good when I'm holding on to something like that up high. So I wouldn't want to try. Uh, are there other things you've heard that are very helpful for people? Because for me, I love the conversations with others who are sort of in this world. I also, gardening for me, getting into nature, running and cycling, exercise for me really helps me sort stuff out in my brain. Have you heard other tricks or tips from folks?
Yeah. So, in addition to getting outside and finding out what's going on in your own community, there are so many groups. People can just Google what's going on in their own community. People are planting milkweed for monarch migrations. They're supporting local farmers who look after biodiversity on their lands. Just yeah, there's so many things. One thing that I learned that I hadn't known before I started writing the book is about some initiatives going on in taken by ranchers in the Saskatchewan grasslands, so that they are protecting biodiversity and bird nesting sites in addition to raising cattle on their lands. And so there's just a gamut of initiatives going on, and that is not to say that people should be letting governments off the hook for policy decisions, because that is also very important to ensure that the laws that we have are followed and that the promises that governments have made to protect at-risk species are followed through on, and that when those laws are made on a provincial level, that they are actually put into effect, because time and time again across the country that is not happening.
Yep. And while as a charity, we don't advocate for any specific politicians or parties or anything, we do recommend everyone who has an election coming up, and that's most of us in Canada in the next year or two, reach out to your candidates and ask, what are you going to do and how are you going to make sure it gets done? Because I think that's the other thing is it's easy to say, I'm going to prioritize biodiversity. It's like, okay, which policy specifically are you putting forward for this? How are you allocating funding? How are you going to vote on an issue of a pipeline versus a forest? They ask the specific questions and make it uncomfortable for them until they can answer those specific questions, because that's how we get those policies, I think. And by uncomfortable, I don't mean anything untoward or nefarious, but if they don't have an answer, we just have to keep asking until they do, or we share with them what we think it is. Now, we've talked a lot. I mean, this is it's at times a heavy book. You talk about very serious subject matter. You experience and share your experience watching some difficult things go on, and supporting others as it goes on. But there is a very clear message and line of hope throughout the book, and there are solutions, and there are ways we can be moving forward. What is it that you really want people who pick up this book to then walk away knowing or feeling or doing?
Well, I think again that initiatives are taking place across the country from military bases. That was another big eye opener for me, that some of Canada's richest biodiversity is found on military bases because
Hmm.
there hasn't been the type of development in them that there has been in other places. That there are these initiatives, as I mentioned, that Saskatchewan ranchers are signing up for, so that it doesn't, become a question of all meat is bad. It becomes a question of what are we doing here that can provide people with a livelihood, that can give people who want to eat meat, but also protect at-risk species and biodiversity. Um, there are, and again, one of the things I did as well is to look at some measures that people are taking who feel that they do not want to wait any longer for governments to take action. And in some cases, this involves actions that are not in line with the law, like blockading roads to try to protect an old growth forest or an old forest, I should say, in Nova Scotia, which is home to the endangered mainland moose, or what happened at Fairy Creek on South
Yeah.
Vancouver Island, an area that's home to at-risk marble murrelets and endangered lichens and other at-risk species. So I look at that as well, and I think that for some people, that is what they feel they need to be doing at this time. Other people are taking other types of actions, and in communities across the country, things are underway, but it is not enough. We need to step up those efforts and really hold governments accountable. We need to make sure that the federal government is actually following the Species at Risk Act. Like, for example, there are provisions in the Act for the federal government to step in when provincial governments are not protecting at risk species on their lands through emergency orders. And
Yeah.
an emergency order in the 21-year now history of the Species at Risk Act has only been issued for 2 species in 20 years. Now, there's a threat right now of implementing another emergency order for caribou in Quebec. But
Mhm.
so far, it's just been the Western chorus frog in Quebec and the greater sage grouse in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So we are not implementing the laws that we have. And so that is a very first step, to implement the laws that we have. There's also many calls from scientists to have a federal law that protects biodiversity as well as species. So in Canada, we've had very much a species by species approach. And while that is important in the case of critically endangered species, it is not a very effective approach. If we look at protecting an ecosystem, then we will be protecting many more species at the same time.
I'm curious. Signs of Life, was that your idea or the publisher?
That was a publisher. Actually, my original idea came from a friend of mine, and it was to call the book The Dead Species Society, which
Oh my,
did not go over
that's
very well with the publisher.
it's catchy. I gotta say, it's a catchy title, and it's not wrong. But I do like the Signs of Life field notes from the Frontlines of Extinction, and I think it's the concept of the field notes is what I think really jumped out at me in that title, because that's what this book feels like. It is, you're telling the stories you have witnessed and experienced in a way that makes them accessible to everybody. And I agree. I think you could be an oil exec and pick up this book and not be offended and throw it down. You might question some things. You might put in some highlights for your PR team later, but you certainly are not going to get upset by it. And I think that's a great, great thing, that more and more people will be able to access this and get behind it and see the passion, compassion, and solutions that are just waiting for the people to fill the roles.
Yes, I do think it is going to take everybody to turn this around in Canada. And again, as the United Nations report pointed out in 2019, we're at a real crossroads here. It is not too late, but we need to start doing things now. We have no time to waste. It really is a need for all hands on deck.
To learn more about Sarah Cox, her recent articles, and current and past books, visit sarahcox.ca. Signs of Life, Field Notes from the Frontlines of Extinction is available at your local bookstore, library, or online. I want to thank Sarah for sharing her time with me during a busy schedule, and of course, you for listening. I encourage you to check out the show notes for this episode in your podcast player or at defenderradio.com to learn more about Signs of Life and read more of Sarah's outstanding coverage on environmental and wildlife issues. Remember to subscribe or follow Defender Radio Podcast wherever you listen, and to sign up to receive updates from the Fur Bears at thefurbearers.com. You can also find the Fur Bearers on Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio and the Fur Bearers, reminding you to stay informed and stay strong.